I need to tell you about a phone call that happened in late January. Carney and Trump spoke for 30 minutes. According to people in the room on the American side, the Canadian Prime Minister had very aggressively walked back his Davos remarks. That was the story the Treasury Secretary told on Fox News that afternoon, and millions of people heard it and moved on. Here's what happened on the Canadian side. Carney walked out to the cameras, paused, and responded to a reporter's question about Bessent's claim. He rolled his eyes. Literally rolled his eyes. On camera. Then he said, "To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos." I've been trying to figure out which moment marks the real turning point in this story. The Davos speech, the Plains of Abraham response, the rolled eyes, and what I keep landing on is that none of those moments is the turning point. Those are the moments you can see. The actual turning point happened earlier and quieter, and in a way that is proving much, much harder to reverse than anyone in Washington seems to have accounted for. This is the story of how the United States may have permanently lost Canada as a dependent, not because of a speech, not because of a tariff response, but because of what a former central banker with a systems-level mind started building the day he took office, and kept building while everyone was watching the rhetoric. Let me show you the timeline, because the speed of this is what makes it remarkable. March 2025. Mark Carney becomes Prime Minister of Canada. He's not a career politician. He ran the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, the period that included the global financial crisis. Then he ran the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, the period that included Brexit. He has spent his entire professional life managing the consequences of disruption that other people didn't see coming. And when he arrived in office, he arrived with a specific read on what was happening between Canada and Washington that was different from almost anyone else's. His read wasn't that Trump was a temporary aberration. His read was that American policy had become so volatile between administrations, swinging so dramatically from one set of commitments to the opposite, that no treaty, no trade deal, no alliance structure could be treated as a reliable foundation for Canadian economic or security planning. What he said publicly at Davos was the polished version of something he had been acting on privately for months. Within weeks of taking office, he started moving. Not announcing, moving. He signed a security and defense partnership with the European Union in June 2025, the first formal agreement of its kind between Canada and Brussels. By October, he was in South Korea, meeting President Xi Jinping on the sidelines, beginning the process of reopening the Canadian-China diplomatic channel that had been functionally frozen since 2018. In November, he signed an agreement with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith on energy policy and pipelines, a quiet but significant move to shore up the western provinces. In December, his government's Buy Canadian procurement policy went into force, redirecting federal contracts over $25 million toward Canadian suppliers. And then, January. In the span of 9 days, he flew to Beijing, met Xi Jinping, the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China since 2017, then flew to Qatar, then flew to Davos. In Beijing alone, he came back with a partial tariff reduction agreement and the beginnings of a framework for broader agricultural trade. He told reporters afterward, 12 new trade deals, 4 continents, 6 months, and then stood at a microphone and told Trump, to his face on the phone, that he meant every word he said. Is this the moment you expected Canada to take this turn? Because I don't think Washington did. Drop your read in the comments. Now, here's what I want you to understand about the structural depth of what's been assembled, because the surface-level diplomatic exchanges are just the visible layer. On February 14th, 2026, 10 days ago, Canada officially signed the agreement to join the European Union's Security Action for Europe program, known as SAFE. This is a €150 billion defense financing instrument, a pool of EU-backed low-interest loans for joint procurement of military equipment. Every EU member state that participates gets access to the pool for modernizing their armed forces. It was designed exclusively for European countries, connected to the EU's broader Readiness 2030 rearmament initiative. Canada is now in it, as the first non-European country to join, ever. Canadian companies can now bid on SAFE contracts alongside European firms, with up to 80% Canadian content allowed. Canada's defense minister, standing in Munich, called it a game changer. What it actually is, structurally, is a severing of a very specific kind of dependency. Canada's defense procurement is no longer exclusively routed through American contractors and American industrial supply chains. Its military modernization will now be shaped, at least partially, by European capability development frameworks, rather than solely by what Washington is willing to sell and on what terms. Sit with the timing of that. February 14th, 2026. The same week the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs, and Trump immediately signed a new executive order finding a different legal mechanism to replace them. Canada's defense minister was in Munich, signing Canada into a European defense procurement pool, while the U.S. administration was cycling through its second legal framework for tariff pressure in 48 hours. Two things were happening simultaneously, in the same week, that almost no outlet put side by side. Let me go deeper on what else has been shifting, because SAFE is just one piece. The fighter jet situation is genuinely extraordinary. Canada committed in 2022 to buying 88 F-35s from Lockheed Martin, the American fifth-generation stealth fighter, built on U.S. software, maintained on U.S. logistics systems, dependent on a cloud-based platform called Odin that runs on American servers. The first 16 planes have been ordered, but Sweden's Saab has now submitted a formal proposal to replace the remaining order with 72 Gripen E fighters and 6 Global Eye surveillance aircraft, built in Canada, with production lines in Quebec and Ontario, promising 12,600 jobs. Canada's industry minister has publicly said she doesn't think the F-35 contract has generated enough Canadian jobs. She's been in Washington trying to extract concessions. No concessions have come. The technical case for the F-35 is overwhelming. A leaked 2021 evaluation had it scoring 95% versus 33% for the Gripen across every category. Military analysts, including the former Chief of Staff of the Canadian Armed Forces, have said switching would be, and I'm paraphrasing here, close to useless in a real conflict. The F-35 is objectively the superior aircraft. But here's the thing that the capability metrics don't capture. The Gripen gives Canada something the F-35 explicitly does not: full sovereign control over its own Air Force software and upgrade path. The F-35 is built around American logistics infrastructure. If Washington decides, in the middle of a trade dispute, to limit Canadian access to that infrastructure, and there is documented concern within the Canadian government that this is not a hypothetical, Canada's entire fighter fleet could be, in the technical language, degraded or grounded. That concern has a name in the defense literature: the kill switch problem. And the fact that it is now a mainstream consideration in Canadian procurement decisions tells you something important about how permanent this trust rupture has become. It's not that Canada believes the United States would actually ground its jets. It's that a country serious about sovereignty cannot afford to build its defense architecture around a system where that option exists at American discretion. Pull back further, and you get the submarine picture, which we've covered in depth, but it belongs in this sequence. 12 new submarines, up to $60 billion in contracts, with the finalists being Germany and South Korea, neither American. The Buy Canadian policy in force. Trade deals with Ecuador, Indonesia, the UAE. Talks restarted with India after years of frozen relations. A China framework that, whatever its limitations, is the first serious Canadian-Chinese diplomatic engagement since the Meng Wanzhou crisis ended. What Carney told Trump on that call, and then publicly confirmed, was not bravado. It was a status update. 4 continents, 12 deals, 6 months, and we're just getting started. Now, I want to be careful here because I think the most honest version of this story requires acknowledging what isn't working and what might not hold. The structural dependency problem is real and has not been solved. Close to 70 to 75% of Canadian exports still go to the United States. Supply chains in automotive, energy, and agriculture are deeply integrated across the border in ways that cannot be unwound in months or even years. The Eurasia Group, in their top risks assessment for 2026, described CUSMA as likely to become a zombie agreement, neither fully dead nor alive, staggering forward while Trump uses sectoral tariffs in steel, aluminum, and auto as ongoing leverage in endless negotiations. They specifically noted that Trump doesn't like Canada's tough, detail-oriented approach to trade talks, and that Carney will struggle to sell concessions that Trump can publicly claim as victories. The diversification math is also harder than the announcement cadence suggests. Canada's second largest trading partner is China, and that relationship comes with its own set of vulnerabilities. Cheap Chinese goods flooding markets, questions about strategic dependence in a different direction, and the ever-present risk of Washington imposing consequences on Canadian companies that engage too deeply with Beijing. Carney himself has drawn a line. No comprehensive free trade deal with China, only targeted tariff reductions. Whether that line holds under sustained pressure from both sides is genuinely uncertain. And yet, I keep coming back to the deeper question, which is not whether Canada's pivot succeeds economically in the near term. The deeper question is whether the strategic intention behind it is permanent. Here's why I think it is, and here's why I think Washington either doesn't see it or doesn't believe it. The United States has spent decades treating Canadian dependence as a structural feature rather than a choice. The assumption embedded in American trade and defense policy toward Canada has always been that geography, supply chains, cultural affinity, and military integration made Canadian alignment with Washington automatic, something that didn't need to be earned because it couldn't be lost. That assumption produced a kind of strategic carelessness. You don't invest in a relationship you think is captive. What the last 12 months have demonstrated is that the assumption was wrong. Canadian alignment was never structural, it was conditional. It was a choice that generations of Canadian governments made because the costs of the alternative seemed too high. What the Trump administration has done, through tariffs, through annexation rhetoric, through State Department meetings with separatists, through the kill switch problem, through Besant going on Fox News and claiming Carney folded when he demonstrably hadn't, is systematically lower the perceived cost of the alternative. Every time a new tariff mechanism is found after the last one gets struck down, Canadian industry does a calculation. Every time a social media post shows the American flag over a map of Canada at 1 a.m., someone in a Canadian procurement office updates a risk assessment. Every time a Washington official says something about economic force in the context of Canadian sovereignty, a Canadian diplomat in Beijing has an easier conversation than they had 6 months before. The infrastructure of Canadian-American integration is still there. The pipelines, the trade flows, the shared airspace under NORAD, the intelligence relationships, the cultural overlap, none of that has disappeared. But the disposition that chose integration and kept choosing it, and would have gone on choosing it indefinitely, that has changed. And dispositions, once they change at the policy level and get institutionalized in treaties, procurement contracts, industrial partnerships, and defense agreements, take a generation to reverse. Carney is 60 years old. He has described this as a hinge moment in Canadian history. He has said Canada is moving from reliance to resilience. He has set a formal goal of doubling non-U.S. exports within a decade. He has been to China, South Korea, Germany, Qatar, and the EU in his first 9 months. He has committed to the largest Canadian military spending increase since the Second World War, deliberately structured to build domestic industrial capacity rather than simply buying American hardware. This is not a response to Trump. This is a response to the discovery that the relationship Canadians thought they had with the United States was not the relationship that existed. And the response is being built into every new contract, every new alliance, every new factory, every new trade framework, in a way that will outlast any single administration. The moment America lost Canada wasn't the Davos speech. It wasn't the eye roll. It wasn't even the annexation rhetoric or the altered map posted at 1 a.m. It was the moment a former central banker looked at the pattern of what was happening and concluded, with the same analytical framework he had applied to financial crises his entire career, this isn't temporary volatility, this is a structural shift, and built accordingly. Washington, from everything visible in its public posture, still believes Canada will come back, that the CUSMA renegotiation will lock the relationship back into place, that economic gravity will overcome diplomatic friction, that Carney is performing for a domestic audience and will fold when the pressure is real enough. I genuinely don't know which side of this resolves correctly, but I know which side is currently building things, and I know which side thinks it doesn't need to. If you were advising Washington right now, what would you tell them? And more importantly, do you think they're even asking the question? Tell me in the comments.